Marcus Wright sat at a polished mahogany table in the upscale restaurant, the soft glow of candlelight flickering against the elegantly set tableware. The air was rich with the aroma of grilled salmon and roasted vegetables, and soft jazz music floated through the air, creating an ambience that should have been relaxing. Instead, Marcus felt a tight knot of apprehension in his stomach. He glanced across the table at his colleague Sarah, who was animatedly discussing a recent case they had been working on together. "And if we can just leverage the precedent set in Morgan versus State, we might have a shot at overturning that ridiculous ruling," Sarah said, her eyes sparkling with conviction. Marcus nodded, his mind partially focused on her words while the other part was acutely aware of the glances exchanged between the restaurant staff. They seemed hesitant, their smiles strained as they served other patrons. It was a subtle but palpable shift, one that made Marcus's heart race. "Marcus, are you listening?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. "Yeah, sorry, he hesitated, shaking his head as if to clear it. "I just have a feeling that we're not exactly welcome here." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, furrowing her brow. "Look around. The staff is avoiding us. I can't shake the feeling that they're uncomfortable serving a black man in a place like this," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah followed his gaze, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. Before she could respond, the silence of the restaurant was pierced by the clatter of heavy boots on the wooden floor. Two policemen, Officers Jenkins and Smith, strode towards their table, their uniforms crisp yet menacing. Marcus felt a surge of unease wash over him as they approached. "Excuse me," Officer Jenkins said, his tone brusque. "We need to ask you to step outside. You're causing a disturbance." "Disturbance?" Marcus echoed incredulously. "There's been no disturbance. We're just having dinner." "Yeah, well, we've had complaints," Officer Smith chimed in, crossing his arms. "You need to come with us." Marcus's pulse quickened, a mix of anger and disbelief flooding through him. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm a paying customer, and I haven't done anything wrong." "Is that so?" Officer Jenkins stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Why don't you empty your pockets then? Let's see if you're carrying anything you shouldn't be." A hush fell over the restaurant as other diners turned to watch. Marcus felt the heat rise in his cheeks, humiliation flooding his system. He glanced at Sarah, who looked aghast, her mouth slightly agape. "Is this really necessary?" she interjected, her voice trembling. "You're making a scene. Just do it," Officer Jenkins barked, his authority palpable. "We're not going to ask you again." With a heavy heart, Marcus stood up, his movements stiff as he reached into his pockets. He pulled out his wallet, keys, and a small notebook, laying them on the table as the eyes of the entire restaurant bore into him. Each item felt like a piece of his dignity slipping away, exposed for all to see. "See? Nothing," he said, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. "Just as I thought," Officer Smith said with a smirk. "You think you can come in here, act like you own the place, and not face the consequences?" "Enough," Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You're abusing your power. This is unacceptable." The officers turned their attention to her, surprise flickering across their faces. "Ma'am, you might want to keep your voice down," Officer Jenkins warned, his tone dripping with condescension. Marcus felt a swell of anger rising within him, a fierce determination igniting in his chest. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had faced similar injustices. Yet, standing there, stripped of his dignity in front of a room full of onlookers, he felt small and powerless. "Let's go," Officer Jenkins said, his eyes still locked on Marcus. "You're coming with us, whether you like it or not." As he stepped forward, Marcus took a deep breath, grounding himself in the moment, knowing that this was only the beginning. The world around him blurred as he focused on the heavy weight of the injustice he had just endured, and a flicker of resolve ignited within him. He would not let this define him. Not now, not ever. Marcus Wright stepped through the door of his apartment, the weight of the evening clinging to him like a heavy cloak. The air inside was thick with the familiar scent of jasmine, a fragrance his sister, Jasmine, had always loved. It was a stark contrast to the bitter taste of humiliation that lingered on his tongue from the restaurant incident. As he closed the door behind him, he leaned against it for a moment, trying to collect himself. He could still hear the laughter of diners, the clinking of glasses, and, most painfully, the sneering voices of the officers who had upended his evening. "Marcus." Jasmine's voice floated from the kitchen, a note of concern lacing her words. She emerged, her brow furrowed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "Just a long night at work," he replied, but the words felt hollow. He knew Jasmine could see through his facade. "Come sit down," she urged, gesturing toward the small dining table. "You can tell me about it over some tea." Marcus nodded, grateful for her insistence. He sank into a chair, feeling the cushions envelop him like a warm embrace. Jasmine busied herself with the kettle, her movements fluid and calming. As the steam curled into the air, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he needed to share. "Jazz, something happened tonight," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was with Sarah at that new restaurant downtown, and, well, it was awful." Jasmine turned, her expression shifting to one of concern. "What do you mean? What happened?" He recounted the evening, the way the staff had hesitated to serve them, the sudden appearance of officers Jenkins and Smith, and the public humiliation that followed. Each word felt like a stone falling from his mouth, heavy and painful. "They accused me of causing a disturbance, Jasmine, in front of everyone. I had to empty my pockets like I was some common criminal." Jasmine's hands trembled slightly as she placed the steaming cup of tea in front of him. "That's disgusting," she said, her voice rising with indignation. "You didn't do anything wrong. You're a respected attorney. They had no right to treat you like that." "I know," he replied, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "But it's not just about me. This happens all the time. I felt so powerless." Jasmine sat down across from him, her eyes fierce with determination. "Listen, Marcus, you have to document this. You need to gather evidence. Talk to people who saw what happened. You can't let them get away with this." He looked at her, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. "You really think that would make a difference?" "Absolutely," she asserted, leaning forward. "You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for everyone who's been treated like this. We have to stand up and be heard." Her words resonated with him, stirring a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he needed. "Okay," he said, nodding slowly. "I'll do it. I'll reach out to local activists and see if they can help." As he spoke, he could feel the tension easing from his shoulders. Jasmine's conviction had ignited something within him, a spark that had been dimmed by the evening's events. They spent the next hour brainstorming how to gather support and evidence, the initial shock of the incident evolving into a plan of action. The following day dawned bright and clear, but Marcus's heart was heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. As he walked through his neighborhood, he was met with a wave of solidarity from those he passed. Neighbors nodded in acknowledgement, friends offered words of encouragement, and even strangers seemed to sense his turmoil. It was as if the entire community was rallying around him. "Marcus," called out Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly woman who lived nearby. "I heard about what happened. I'm so sorry. It's not right, you know. You're a good man." "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins," he replied, grateful for her support. "I appreciate that more than you know." As he continued on his way, he saw a group of young activists gathered at the local park, their voices passionate as they discussed issues of social justice. He hesitated for a moment, then approached them. "Hey, I'm Marcus. I could use some help." They turned to him, curiosity in their eyes. As he shared his story, he was met with nods of understanding and expressions of empathy. They encouraged him to document his experience, to amplify his voice, and to take a stand against the injustice he had faced. In that moment, surrounded by a community that shared his pain and anger, Marcus felt a profound sense of purpose. The journey ahead would be challenging, but he was no longer alone. Together, they would shine a light on the darkness that had tainted his evening and so many others like it. Marcus Wright sat in the dimly lit office of Mr. Thompson, a prominent civil rights attorney whose reputation loomed large in Atlanta. The walls were adorned with photographs of past victories, moments frozen in time when justice had triumphed. The atmosphere was thick with determination as Marcus recounted the harrowing events from the restaurant, his voice steady but laced with the weight of indignation. "I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like that," he confessed, his brow furrowing as he recalled the humiliation he'd faced. "I felt like I was being stripped of my identity, not just as a man, but as a professional." Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. "You've got to understand, Marcus, this is about more than just you. It's about the systemic issues that plague our society. We can't let this slide. The police need to be held accountable, and your case can be a pivotal moment in that struggle." "What do I need to do?" Marcus asked, a flicker of resolve igniting within him. He wanted to fight, not just for himself, but for those who had suffered similarly in silence. "First, we need to gather evidence. Witness statements, video footage, everything you can get your hands on. The more we have, the stronger our case will be," Mr. Thompson instructed, his voice firm and encouraging. As Marcus left the office, he felt an unfamiliar surge of purpose coursing through him. The world outside felt different, brighter yet more daunting. He knew he was stepping into a battle that would require courage and resilience, but for the first time since the incident, he felt empowered. Over the next few days, Marcus threw himself into the task of collecting evidence. He reached out to the restaurant for security footage and contacted fellow diners who had witnessed the altercation. Each call was a reminder of the injustice he had faced, each conversation a step towards reclaiming his dignity. He found himself in a cafe, sitting across from an older gentleman named Mr. Daniels, who had been at the restaurant that night. "Mr. Wright, I saw what happened," the man said, his voice heavy with empathy. "It was appalling. You didn't deserve that. I'll give you my statement." Marcus nodded gratefully, his heart swelling with appreciation for the support. "Thank you, sir. It means a lot to have you stand with me." As the days turned into weeks, the weight of the evidence began to pile up. Marcus found himself poring over the footage, reliving the moment of humiliation, but he also spotted the glimmer of hope in the faces of those who had stood by him. Each witness shared their anger, their disbelief, and their determination to see justice served. Then came the breakthrough. While reviewing the gathered evidence, Marcus stumbled upon reports detailing Officer Jenkins' history of complaints, numerous accusations of excessive force and racial profiling. The discovery sent a chill down his spine, igniting a fiery resolve within him. This wasn't just about his case. It was about a pattern of abuse that needed to be exposed. "Mr. Thompson, you need to see this," Marcus exclaimed, rushing back to the attorney's office. He laid the documents on the desk, his hands trembling with a mix of excitement and dread. Mr. Thompson scanned the reports, his expression growing grave. "This changes everything. If we can prove that Jenkins has a history of misconduct, it strengthens our case significantly. We're not just fighting for one man's dignity anymore. We're fighting against a culture of racism within the police force." Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline. "Then we have to go all in. I won't stop until there's accountability." "Exactly," Mr. Thompson replied, his voice steady. "We'll prepare for the fight of our lives. You've got the community behind you, and together, we can make a difference." As Marcus left the office that day, the weight of the world felt a little lighter. The path ahead was fraught with challenges, but he no longer felt alone. The community was rallying behind him, and with every witness statement, every piece of evidence, he was not just reclaiming his dignity, he was igniting a movement for justice. He was ready to take a stand, not only for himself but for all those who had faced the same struggles, their voices rising in a chorus of resilience and hope. As the sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline, casting long shadows across the city, tension crackled in the air like static electricity. Marcus Wright stood at the podium, his heart pounding in his chest as he faced a sea of reporters, cameras flashing like lightning in the gathering dusk. The police department had called the press conference in a desperate attempt to discredit his claims, but Marcus was determined to turn the tide in his favor. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady despite the storm swirling within him. He glanced at the officers standing stiffly behind the police chief, their expressions a mix of arrogance and contempt. "I stand before you today not just as a man wronged, but as a representative of countless individuals who have faced systemic racism and injustice in our community." A murmur spread through the crowd, and Marcus could see the skepticism on some faces, but he pressed on. "On that fateful night, I was humiliated in front of my peers, reduced to a suspect without cause. My dignity was stripped away by those sworn to protect us. This is not just about me. This is about the systemic issues that plague our society." As he spoke, he felt the weight of his family and community behind him. Jasmine's fierce encouragement echoed in his mind, fueling his resolve. He continued, "We need accountability. We need transparency. The actions of Officer Jenkins and Officer Smith do not reflect the values we uphold as a society. They are not just badges. They are human beings who must be held accountable for their actions." A reporter raised her hand, her voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Wright, do you have evidence to support your claims?" The police chief has stated that the officers acted appropriately during the incident. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the eyes of the public upon him. "Yes, I do," he replied, pulling out a folder filled with witness statements and security footage screenshots. "I have gathered testimony from diners who witnessed the humiliation I suffered. I have video evidence that shows the officers had no justifiable reason to approach me that night." The reporters leaned in closer, their interest piqued. He could see the shift in their expressions as they began to grasp the gravity of his words. This is not just an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed. The community deserves to know the truth. Suddenly, a voice called out from the back of the room. "Why should anyone believe you? You're just another disgruntled citizen looking for a payday." The crowd shifted, and Marcus recognized the voice as belonging to a local journalist known for his sensationalism. Instead of backing down, Marcus stood tall, meeting the man's gaze. "Because I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for every person who has ever felt the sting of discrimination. I'm fighting for justice, not just in this case, but for the countless others who have been silenced." As he spoke, he felt the energy in the room change. People were nodding, whispering among themselves. It was as if a spark had ignited a fire of solidarity. Marcus could see the support growing, and it filled him with hope. After the conference, as he stepped away from the podium, Marcus was approached by a group of activists he had been in touch with. "Marcus, that was powerful," said one of them, a woman named Lisa. "You spoke from the heart, and it resonated with people. We're with you." "Thank you. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," Marcus replied, gratitude welling up inside him. Just as they began to strategize their next steps, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his heart dropping as he read the anonymous message. "Back off, or face the consequences." The words felt like a punch to the gut, but he quickly steeled himself. He looked at Lisa and the others, determination sparking in his eyes. "They think they can scare me into silence, but I won't back down. Not now, not ever." "Good," Lisa said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll stand together. You're not alone in this fight." As the group rallied around him, Marcus felt an unyielding sense of purpose. No matter what threats loomed ahead, he knew that he had the strength of his community behind him. He was ready to face whatever came next, fueled by the belief that justice would prevail. The room buzzed with anticipation as Marcus Wright stood at the front of the community center, his heart pounding in his chest. The pale yellow walls were adorned with posters advocating for justice and equality, yet the atmosphere felt heavy with unspoken tension. This meeting was not just another gathering. It was an opportunity to confront Officer Jenkins and demand accountability for the humiliation he had endured. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I know this isn't easy, but we need to talk about what happened to me that night at the restaurant. I refuse to let this slide." The audience was a mix of familiar faces, friends, family, and community leaders, each one bearing the weight of their own experiences with injustice. As Marcus scanned the room, he locked eyes with his sister, Jasmine, who offered an encouraging nod. He drew a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation ahead. Just then, Officer Jenkins entered the room, flanked by a few of his colleagues. The tension in the air thickened as murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jenkins wore a smug expression, as if he was ready to dismiss Marcus's grievances. Marcus felt a surge of anger, but remained composed. "Officer Jenkins," Marcus called out, his voice cutting through the chatter. "I need you to explain your actions that night. Why did you choose to target me?" Jenkins smirked, crossing his arms. "You were causing a disturbance, Mr. Wright. The staff called us. You think you're above the law just because you wear a suit?" The crowd erupted in outrage, voices rising in protest. "That's not true," shouted an elderly woman in the back. "We saw what happened." Before Marcus could respond, another officer, Officer Ramirez, unexpectedly stepped forward. "That's not how it went down, Jenkins," he said, his tone firm. "I was there that night. Marcus was just having dinner. You made a mistake." Gasps filled the room as all eyes turned to Ramirez. Jenkins's face darkened with disbelief and anger. "You don't know what you're talking about, Ramirez. You're gonna regret this." "No, Jenkins," Ramirez shot back, his voice gaining strength. "You're the one who should be worried. This isn't just about one incident anymore. It's about accountability." Marcus felt a rush of hope as Ramirez's words resonated with the crowd. Encouraged by the unexpected support, he stepped forward. "This is what we need. Officers who will stand up against the culture of corruption and racism. We will not be silenced." Jenkins's bravado faltered under the weight of the community's scrutiny, and Marcus seized the moment. "If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. We must hold these officers accountable, not just for my sake, but for everyone who has faced injustice." The room erupted in applause, the sound reverberating off the walls. Marcus could see the tide turning. News cameras, which had been quietly documenting the meeting, were now focused on the exchange, capturing the pivotal moment that could change everything. As they left the meeting, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The media was abuzz with reports of Ramirez's statements and the growing public support for his case. "This is just the beginning," Jasmine said, walking beside him. "You have the community behind you now. They won't let this go." "That's the power of truth," Marcus replied, a smile breaking through his earlier tension. "We're not just fighting for me anymore. We're fighting for everyone who has been wronged." The day had shifted something deep within him. With Ramirez's unexpected support and the backing of the community, Marcus felt the tide turning. He was ready to face the challenges ahead, not just as an individual, but as part of a movement toward justice. His phone buzzed with notifications, each one a reminder that his story was gaining momentum, and with it came the possibility of real change. As they walked toward their car, Marcus glanced back at the community center, a place that had transformed from a simple venue into a battleground for justice. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since that fateful night, he felt a glimmer of hope. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Marcus Wright sat at the plaintiff's table, a mixture of anticipation and anxiety coursing through him. He glanced at Mr. Thompson, who sat beside him, flipping through the pages of their meticulously prepared case. The air was thick with the weight of expectation, not just for Marcus, but for an entire community that had rallied behind him. They were ready for justice, ready for a reckoning. "Your Honor," Mr. Thompson began, his voice steady and authoritative, as he addressed the judge. "We are here today to present evidence that not only supports my client's claims, but also exposes a pattern of systemic misconduct within the police department." His words resonated through the courtroom, capturing the attention of everyone present, including the reporters in the back, their notepads poised for the next big story. Marcus felt a surge of determination as he watched the prosecutor call Officer Smith to the stand. The officer's demeanor was rigid, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Officer Smith," Mr. Thompson began, "can you recount the events of that night at the restaurant?" Yes," Smith stammered, his voice shaky. "We were called to the scene because there was a disturbance. I approached Mr. Wright and—" "Excuse me," Mr. Thompson interrupted, leaning forward. "Is it true that you were the first to accuse Mr. Wright of causing this disturbance without any evidence?" Smith hesitated, the weight of the public scrutiny pressing down on him. "Well, we felt there was something off." "Something off?" Marcus interjected, unable to contain his frustration. "You mean that I was black dining in a predominantly white establishment? That's what you felt was off?" The courtroom murmured, and the judge banged the gavel to restore order. "Mr. Wright, please allow the witness to answer," the judge said. But Marcus's heart raced as he felt the eyes of the gallery on him, a mix of support and disbelief. Before Smith could respond, Mr. Thompson presented video evidence from the restaurant's security cameras. The footage played, showing Marcus and Sarah engaged in conversation, the police officers approaching with hostility. The contrast was stark. There was no disturbance, only a peaceful dinner abruptly interrupted by unwarranted aggression. "Your Honor," Mr. Thompson said, pointing towards the screen, "this footage speaks volumes." "Officer Smith, can you explain how this aligns with your testimony?" Smith's face paled, and he fumbled for words. It was a mistake. I thought." "Thought what?" Mr. Thompson pressed. "That a black man couldn't possibly be dining without causing trouble?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs again, but this time, they were whispers of solidarity for Marcus. It was as if the tide had turned, and he could feel the support swell around him. He exchanged a glance with Jasmine, who sat in the front row, her eyes filled with pride. As the trial progressed, the tension escalated further when Mr. Thompson called Officer Jenkins to the stand. The moment Jenkins walked in, a palpable shift occurred. Marcus's heart raced as he remembered the humiliation he faced at the officer's hands. Jenkins looked more defiant, but the cracks were beginning to show. "Officer Jenkins," Mr. Thompson began, "can you explain to the court why you were involved in multiple misconduct cases prior to this incident?" "I've never been charged with anything," Jenkins replied, his bravado wavering. "Is that so?" Mr. Thompson countered, producing a dossier of previous complaints filed against Jenkins. "Here are testimonies from multiple individuals who have faced similar treatment at your hands. Would you like to revise your statement?" Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, the color draining from his face as the evidence mounted against him. "These are just accusations," he shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "No, officer," Marcus said, standing up, his voice firm. "These are the truths that have been hidden for too long. It's time for accountability." The jury listened intently as the evidence unfolded. The mounting proof of Jenkins's misconduct painted a damning picture. Then, the moment arrived. The jury returned, and the foreman stood to deliver their verdict. "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Marcus Wright." A wave of emotion surged through Marcus as the courtroom erupted in applause. He felt a profound sense of victory, not just for himself, but for everyone who had faced similar injustices. With tears in his eyes, he stood tall, knowing that change was not only possible, but already beginning to take shape in their community. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and watch this next story that's very exciting.